Welcome to this second session of the conference. This session is on vulnerabilized persons in disability and illness. I'll be chairing this session. My name is Dr. Maeve McEwen, or McEwen if you're Northern Irish like me. I'm an assistant professor in political theory at the University of Groningen. I'm a white woman and I have long curly brown hair. I'm wearing tortoiseshell glasses and a black silk blouse. I was thrilled to be asked to participate in this conference. I attended last year and it was really excellent and I learned a lot. I have a hidden disability, epilepsy, and I work on structural injustice, and I'm very supportive of efforts to make philosophy more inclusive for people with disabilities. I'm delighted to introduce Professor Havi Carel from the University of Bristol. Professor Carel is the author of numerous books, including Phenomenology of Illness and Illness, the Cry of the Flesh. Her research interests include the philosophy of medicine, phenomenology, epistemic injustice in health, and film and philosophy. So over to you, Havi.
Thank you so much, Maeve. So I'm Professor Havi Carel from the University of Bristol. I'm a philosopher of medicine. I'm a woman and I'm wearing a dark olive green top. If there's anything I say that is not easily understood, or if you need me to slow down, please just put that down in the chat and somebody will pass that on to me. And I will say more about my what brought me to philosophy of medicine in a minute when I've managed to share my screen. And I'll explain why things are a bit unusual for me today. Here we go. Right, so is that okay? You should be seeing the slides on your screen in a small little square on the side, which is me. Yeah, so thank you to Shelley and Joe for the kind invitation. You can probably guess I'm not at home. I'm actually at my parents' home and I'm helping my mother look after my father, who's very, very ill. So vulnerabilization or vulnerability are indeed a very much what's happening in this house. And I should also say now already that I'm very sorry I'm not able to attend many of the other talks, but we're very busy with my dad's treatment, and I'm also traveling back home on the Thursday. So this is not the easiest of talks I've ever given, but I'll give it a go. Right, so my work in philosophy of medicine came from my own diagnosis with a very rare lung disease that affects women only, called LAM or LAM. And through the various experiences I've had, which were primarily experiences of disability and of deteriorating health over a long period of time. And for about 15 years, I worked almost exclusively on the philosophy of illness. I used a phenomenological approach, so I hope this will have some links with Melinda's talk that was just before me. But one issue I grappled with a lot in my work is the question: what makes all the people who are ill part of the same group, or are they part of the same group? And one thing that became obvious to me is that illness is experienced very subjectively, very differently, and also it's experienced differentially over time. So the same health condition can be experienced differently by somebody in the week in which they receive their diagnosis, or when symptoms first appear, and how they experience their, say, chronic illness 15 years down the line or 10 years down the line. And one important thing for me, also in the use of phenomenology, was to try not to generalize and not to impose my own interpretation on illness experiences of other people. So I've only ever spoken to for myself, but I've always tried to abstract away from my contingent situation onto trying to say something more general about the experience of illness, something about how bodily failure affects us. I wrote about what I called bodily doubt, to talk about the way in which our tacit trust in our own bodies becomes degraded in illness. I wrote about changes to our experiences of space and time. And there were many other different phenomenological characteristics, which, again, were not specifically about my own situation, but arose from what I later learned was called autoethnography, using my own experiences to try and carefully and responsibly, I hope, extrapolate. Now, recently, I started thinking, after reading one of Shelley's papers that I'll come back to in a minute, thinking that actually some of these experiences are shared with other people. So, for example, somebody who teaches philosophy in a couple of UK prisons contacted me and said she shared some of my work with people who are incarcerated, and that the things I said about the loss of bodily freedom and the loss of the ability to freely step out into the world and navigate your own way, and the experience of bodily freedom really resonated with the people who she taught. And they talked a lot about how they felt that their bodily freedom has been taken away, and about how their own conception of space has been radically changed through being incarcerated. And that, of course, is also a thing that's picked up in other phenomenologists' work. For example, Sean Gallagher's work on solitary confinement and what happens to our bodily experiences after we spend a very long time by ourselves on our own. Then I did some shared work with Ian Kidd. Actually, this is a shared paper with Ian on epistemic injustice. And Ian and I really wrote a lot about epistemic injustice in healthcare. And then we started seeing that there are actually other groups of people who have a lot in common with people who are ill, people who are patients, and that this group is much more diverse and much more heterogeneous than the group of patients, but still has what I hope you will agree are some prominent shared features. So in early 2021, Ian and I published a paper called The Predicament of Patients. And in that paper, we said, well, a lot has been written about epistemic injustice in healthcare, but it's not just testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. There's a whole host of other kinds of interactions, not all of which are distinctly epistemic or solely epistemic. And they create what we called, following Jose Medina, a predicament, which is simply a situation, to use the existential term, a situation with a capital S in which one finds oneself when they are ill. Now, one very prominent feature of the experience of that predicament, of in being in this predicament of patients, is that you're constantly needing the help of, sometimes being part of, and often having very, very intensive contact with institutions. And that led us to think about the characteristics of institutions such as healthcare, education, police, the criminal law system, and the way in which they interact with individuals who come into contact with these institutions. So here are a few characteristics. They're often very large institutions, they're complex, they have a lot of bureaucracy, they have a hierarchy that is often not obvious to an outsider. There's often a jargon. If you enter a court of law, you'll hear a lot of professional terminology, not all of which will be pardon me, will be obvious. Oh, sorry. And the same in medicine. Again, complexity, hierarchy, bureaucracy, jargon. Now, one other thing that you often find in large, bureaucratic, complex, hierarchical, jargon-laden institutions are negative stereotypes that might pertain to patients, might pertain to disabled people, might pertain to people who are incarcerated or undergoing a criminal law investigation of some sort. And what happens is that all of these kinds of characteristics of institutions can end up coming together to obstruct the practical and epistemic agency of people with chronic illness. And of course, also of people from other groups. So people who come into contact with social care, or parents of children who have additional needs or require educational support beyond what's available in the classroom. They all have the same kind of constant rubbing against large-scale, bureaucratic, complex institutions that are hard to understand. And what Ian and I thought is that this is a part of what makes people in these groups vulnerable, and it needs some scrutiny and spelling out, which is what we tried to do in this paper. So we call these people in those situations vulnerabilized, and we're again following Shelley's observation that one is not born vulnerable but becomes such because of particular legal, cultural, normative, and historical arrangements. So people become vulnerable through events that happen to them in their lives. They fall ill, they have an accident, their parents can't look after them, and through the actions of others. And what I'm particularly keen to emphasize here is how the actions of others, who are people who work for institutions of the sort I was describing, how the actions of others can be grounded in virtuous and just behavior, or can be grounded in vice of the sort I will talk about in a minute. So people become vulnerable through events and the actions of others, and this is a particular problem when such vulnerabilized individuals come into contact with institutions. And indeed, these are the very institutions that can sometimes vulnerabilize people. And Shelley's example in a forthcoming paper is that of care homes during the pandemic in Canada. And she talks about how people in care homes were exposed to the virus, were infected with the virus, were not cared for or protected properly, and the ways in which society understands disability in a way that enabled that to happen. And I hope, tell me if I'm misconstruing your thinking here, Shelley, but I think also becomes normalized. So we're talking about a big and messy group of people with learning disabilities, with mental ill health, other disabilities, people who've had the misfortune to have only very limited education, young people who've grown up in the context of domestic violence, people with neurodevelopmental disorders, the very old and the very young. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's meant to capture that this becoming vulnerabilized is something that we can routinely and unthinkingly and unreflectively cause to many other people. And I think the children might be a kind of very obvious example here in the way we say, or at least people used to say, a lot of people still think, that children should be seen and not heard, right? That is, if you like, a perfect illustration of what we call epistemic injustice. Children's testimonies and children's interpretations of situations are often downgraded, very often to their very own enormous personal cost in cases of child abuse, for example. So this is a really very heterogeneous grouping we're talking about here, but we think that it doesn't damage the coherence of the concept of being or becoming vulnerabilized. Because what we want to say is that there are external features of a situation that cause vulnerability. And this is not an internal or intrinsic trait of any particular individual. It has to do with what happened to them, with how others treated them. And the topic we're looking at here today, how institutions, how they get processed through an institution such as healthcare. So if you think you go to your doctor, they order some tests, you come back to the doctor, they send you to the hospital, you become, say, hospitalized, you have to have a procedure, the way in which you get sort of chewed through an institution in that manner. Now, we wanted to focus on institutions rather than individuals because this, what we want to say about vulnerabilization is not about the moral responsibility or the culpability of any particular individual, although individual moral failings will have a lot to do with what we're talking about here. And it's also not about the moral responsibility or culpability of those who are vulnerabilized. So it's not that I'm blind to the fact that many of the people who are in the criminal justice system have done terrible things, but I'm interested in how they have come to be in that place in the first place, if you like. So vulnerabilities are created. They can be caused or exacerbated by the personal, social, political, economic, or environmental situations of individuals or social groups. And that includes, of course, their interactions with institutions. Now, you say, well, what's the problem? You know, if you want to get your benefits, you fill in a form and you submit it online. If you get in trouble with the law, then, you know, you're due to get a state-funded solicitor and you will get support. If you're ill, then in the UK, there's free, universally available, free at the point of contact, healthcare available to everybody. Where's the problem? The problem comes with, we think, the way in which institutions standardize the people they are serving or dealing with. So, for example, if say the benefits example, there's a form, it's 80 pages long. You need to be quite literate to complete it. You need to be able to bring and synthesize a lot of information. You need to have the concentration, the focus, and the tenacity to continue work your way through the entire form. You need to have the financial ability to wait several months before you get a response and you get benefits, if at all. Now, lots and lots of people can't do those things. So here is where the problem starts to emerge. So you say, well, you come to the doctor, you just sit in the waiting room and wait for your name to be called. But if you have sensory processing disorders, for example, then the bright neon lighting in the bright fluorescent lighting in the waiting room and the squishy, sticky faux leather purple chairs could be just too much for you. If you've got a social anxiety disorder, you can't necessarily sit in a room like that and wait for an hour and a half. So institutions want people often to give them information that they need in order to treat them. But a lot of people have difficulties processing information and applying it. Some people struggle to follow rules. Don't use your mobile phone in the waiting room. Not possible for some people. Some people have a limited ability to organize and plan and act effectively. Some can't advocate for themselves. Some are suspicious of institutions. Some can't tolerate the smell And some people just become very distressed when they're in unfamiliar places. The problem is that these are the very people whose reliance on institutions is probably quite a bit more extensive than that of people who don't have these kinds of difficulties. And this creates a tension because the reliance on the institutions is more pronounced, but also more fraught. So probably the people who want the least to be involved in the workings of the criminal justice system are actually in the system. So what do we mean by this term vulnerabilization? What is it to vulnerabilize? Well, we mean, amongst other things, the ways in which sometimes people who work for institutions or the regulations and routines of norms of institutions can impose or exacerbate or intensify or prolong or exploit a person's vulnerabilities so as to make them more harmful and to make that person's situation worse. Now, often vulnerabilization can occur through careless institutional processes. The teacher sent an email to the educational psychologist, but the educational psychologist was on annual leave. So the email got bumped down 150 other emails and got left. The probation officer couldn't get in touch with the social worker, so emergency housing wasn't sorted out for somebody who's just come out of prison. So there's lots and lots of cases like that where the vulnerabilization can occur through careless or carelessly carried out institutional processes, miscommunication between parts of an institution or different institutions, or bureaucratic demands that make practical things like travel nearly impossible. So I had the misfortune of having to board a flight a few days ago, and it was very nearly impossible to actually supply the correct and full documentation needed in order to board an airplane in COVID times. Now, going back to Shelley's work, this is something that Shelley emphasizes. The term to vulnerabilize is also intended to emphasize the dynamic character of vulnerability. So it's not a fixed state, and it's not an internal or immutable, let alone natural state. People become vulnerabilized through processes such as the ones I'm describing. So what are those dynamics of vulnerabilization? So first, subjecting someone to violent or discriminatory or degrading behavior can cause that person to adopt behaviors that increase their own vulnerability. So some people can be very antagonistic towards the police, and that's because they were treated badly by police in the past. Perhaps in a discriminatory fashion, perhaps in a degrading fashion. Second is that resisting vulnerabilizing behaviors incurs costs. So speaking up in a lot of those situations, saying, I can't fill in this form, I'm uncomfortable in this waiting room, why are you arresting this person? These kinds of interventions could incur enormous costs, physical, mental, emotional, and often financial. So here's an example. Here's a document called the Traveller Movement, and here is something in that, a quote from that document. There's been a lack of trust for a long time. You can't build trust instantly. The thing that will build that trust up is for the police to look inwards, stop looking at gypsies and travelers. It's easier to look at the community and say, it's you that are slightly dysfunctional, you're not talking to us. It's much more difficult to look at yourself and say, what is it about us that's stopping them from engaging? So the question here is aimed at the police, saying to the police, why is the traveller community not engaging with you? What is it about what you're doing as an institution or as people who represent an institution that is stopping them from engaging? So the failings are attributed to users, but Ian and I wanted to actually focus on what we called institutional opacity. So I've talked about people who are vulnerabilized, and their great reliance on institutions such as social care, healthcare, and education, and so on. But those institutions can be very opaque for such people. So, as I said, they're large, complex, they're difficult to navigate. There's lots of jargon and local dialects, as well as different norms and modes of operating. And what this can cause is for some institutions to be epistemically opaque to their users, but very obvious and very clear to their agents. And that on its own can create a big discrepancy or a miscommunication. When a doctor uses a medical term without explaining it to a patient, for example, that's epistemically opaque to the user of the healthcare institution, but not to the agent. So there's lots of values that we see on a lot of institutional mission statements and in similar documents: transparency, inclusion, welcoming to all, being just, being trustworthy. These could be kind of flagged up values that are meant to represent the institution as a whole, but in fact, it could be that more local institutional processes operate against such values and in fact undermine them. And what we find as a result is an epistemically unjust institution that is opaque to the very people it is intended to help. So institutional opacity is this general tendency within large-scale and internally complex institutions to increasingly become resistant to forms of epistemic assessment and understanding. What are the effects of institutional opacity? Well, if you're a user of such an institution and the institution is repeatedly opaque to you and you don't know how to get what you need and how to explain who you are and what your needs are, it can erode the individual's epistemic confidence and his or her capacity to enact appropriate styles of interpersonal presentation and epistemic performance. An opaque institution also conceals the precise nature and operations of the relevant economies of credibility. It can erode solidarity and collective trust. And here's a very iconic, sadly, example in the UK, at least. Philippa Day and Jodie Whiting were two women who applied for benefits with support from the state because they're unable to work. And they both committed suicide on separate occasions. And Philippa's sister said in one of her interviews, she said that Philippa's poor mental health meant she was not able to handle the battle with the Department of Work and Pensions for the reinstatement of her benefits. So her benefits were stopped, and she wasn't well enough to be able to advocate for herself. And she left diaries in which she wrote that her dealings with the Department of Work and Pensions made her feel trapped and isolated from the world. But if you look at the words used here, a battle for reinstating of the benefits, feeling trapped, there is a real sense that the interaction between this vulnerabilized individual and the institution is antagonistic, that the institution is not helping, that this person is just becoming ever more vulnerabilized by the dealings with it and being unable to get what they need from it. So there are at least 69 suicides and suicide attempts in the UK linked to stopped benefits between 2014 and 2020. So of course, the effects are far broader than the epistemic ones I've mentioned on previous slides. The important thing for us was to remember that the very institutions that are meant to care for us can also abandon, ignore, silence, harm, and even kill the very people they are entrusted to care for. And once again, Shelley in her paper says it's carceral, it's not caring. And there are many, many instances in which institutions and institutional neglect harms patients. The Francis report is one such from recent years, but there's always lots. So I want to finish by saying something about this, the two levels at which this kind of epistemic injustice can take place. And that's the institutional level, what we call institutional failings, which is institutional loss of an ethos of of justice and loss of institutional transparency, when institutions become opaque to people, when institutions lose people's trust in them. And the personal level, which is the level of personal vices that I mentioned earlier. So I think those two levels operate analogously to undermine and vulnerabilize particular persons and groups. So as an example, the Metropolitan Police, again in London, in the UK, was deemed to have what was called institutional racism. And that means that, of course, there were bigoted and racist police officers in the force, but there was also an institutional level atmosphere of racism where jokes were permitted, where violent behavior towards non-white people was permitted, and so on. So if we find racism in an institution, this could be the responsibility or the vice of individuals, but it could also amount to the level of institutional failings. And again, if you think about the stigma that was very common around when I was a kid, every class had a stupid kid or a few stupid kids. And the kids who were stupid were deemed stupid in virtue of their own innate internal low intelligence. Now, of course, that wasn't the case. These were children with various emotional and learning disabilities and additional needs that were simply unaddressed. Now we can see how a stupid kid could be badly mistreated by an impatient or unempathic teacher at the level of a personal vice. And we can also see how a child like that would fail to be diagnosed with dyslexia, for example. And that would be an institutional level failing. So the personal vices of teachers and the institutional opacity when such children's parents try to get them an educational plan, try to get them additional help in the classroom, have to take the school or the local authority to a tribunal. This is all becomes the level of institutional failings and institutional opacity. So there could be personal vices involved in cases of vulnerabilization, impatience, lack of empathy, callousness, and so on. And there could also be institutional level failures that can be that need to be catalogued, scrutinized, and eventually, we hope, ameliorated. So the two levels combine and ramify to vulnerabilize. I think I'm going to stop here to leave some time for discussion, but just to say our paper, Institutional Opacity, Epistemic Vulnerability and Institutional Testimonial Justice, was recently published open access in the International Journal of Philosophical Studies. And I'll just close by acknowledging again my co-author, Ian Kidd from University of Nottingham. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Havi, for that excellent talk. Our first question is going to be from Shelley, and she's just going to come on the screen to ask her question.
Thank you, Havi. That was so interesting. I'm very honored that you and Ian are using my work on vulnerabilization as a practice. And I wanted to ask you about that, the motivation for me to think of vulnerability in terms of vulnerabilization, as a practice, as an activity, rather than a property of people that they, something that they possess, an attribute, etc. Derives from my use of Foucault and his influence on my thinking. And I'm wondering if you could tell us where your, what drove you to think in those terms.
Thanks, Shelley. Yeah, I know. So you use Foucault's concept of eventualization to describe, I think, a process that exactly what we're trying to describe, how through a series of contingent historical events, a particular identity or a particular a particular vulnerability can attach to an individual, and how it's not intrinsic and internal to them. So what those two aspects were what was important to us. One is that it's not internal to the person, but it comes out of this constant rubbing against institutions in a variety of ways. And the second is this emphasis that it's contingent. It could easily have been otherwise. So going back to the example of the stupid kid, if they had proper dyslexia screening and proper one-to-one support in the classroom and proper booster sessions, they suddenly cease to be stupid, quote unquote. So I think that's really where we've come to that. We're building much more, I think, than you on the epistemic injustice conception. And we're more specifically interested in ways in which people become epistemically vulnerabilized rather than vulnerabilized in general. So I think your conception just really helpfully clarified to us something really important, which is that people can be epistemically reduced over time and lose their epistemic confidence, their epistemic capacity, and their epistemic agency through such repeated negative interactions with institutions that they often don't choose to engage with, but have to engage with.
Thanks very much. That's a great answer.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Corinne Lajoie. Thank you for this talk, Professor Carel. I'm wondering what kinds of connections you see between your theorization of vulnerability in institutions and Mackenzie et al.'s notion of pathogenic vulnerability. They propose a taxonomy of vulnerability that distinguishes between inherent, situational, and pathogenic vulnerability. Pathogenic vulnerability is a type of vulnerability that is increased or created due to structural injustice, and in particular by organized responses to the perceived vulnerability of certain groups.
Okay, it would be really helpful if I could know if there is specific reference to institutions in that concept. I don't know if you can clarify. We can move on and then come back to this as
Sure, perhaps Corinne can respond in the chat. Oh, apologies,
yeah.
There's building work here that keeps interrupting. Hopefully Corinne can respond in the chat and we'll come back.
Yes, that'd be really helpful.
In the meantime, Joe has a question and he's going to come on screen.
That's okay. Let's go with the Q&A questions.
Okay, sure. So we have a talk from Johan Go. So thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm interested in your claim that one is not born vulnerable. It seems that we're all vulnerable in an important sense, given the nature of our fragile bodies and the ontological realities that characterize us qua human beings. Vulnerability may be a matter of degree, but there seems to be something like baseline vulnerability that is present in all of us, regardless of the actions of others. To me, that seems like a powerful thought to motivate solidarity and norms of universal care. Do you think this idea of universal baseline vulnerability is useful, or might it detract from the situational vulnerability you're trying to highlight?
Yes, thank you so much. That is just spot on. That is really, really useful, because I should have said at the beginning that a lot of the work on phenomenology of illness, and mine in particular, has that sort of starting point. So thanks. That's a really helpful reminder. That one thing that happens, for example, in illness, or possibly when people become disabled in certain contexts with some disabilities, is that it becomes that vulnerability that is very much tacit, if you like, possibly unconscious, possibly repressed, becomes salient, becomes obvious, comes to the fore in ways that it doesn't in healthy people. So I spent a very, very long time trying to think about what makes healthy people, what characterizes health. So, you know, Sarge has this notion of the transparency of health. You just take your body for granted. Merleau-Ponty talks about the intentional arc that connects us to the world, having this kind of, you know, that taught connection to the world where everything is immediate and pre-reflective and obvious. And I think what illness does, and possibly disabilities and other situations of the sort I was describing, is it introduces a distrust and a hesitancy and a doubt to the very bodily experience we have, which is, I think, in health, one of wellness, of integrity, of capacity, of agency, of ability. You know, so Heidegger talks about sein können, being able to be, right? So that kind of, if you like, kind of virile energy that enables people to go out into the world and say, I can change things, I can make myself become who I want to be. So I agree with you that there is a universal vulnerability, but I think it is very much tucked under that, you might say naive, you might say arrogant, you might say unjustified sense of ability and even invincibility. I think young people in particular, that is shattered in cases of illness. So I think you're right. Ontologically, there is a universal shared vulnerability that comes in virtue of us being made of very soft tissues and very fragile bones, but that that healthy people often spend large portions of their lives, in particular as young adults, entirely oblivious to that fact. So I think it's something that philosophers have emphasized, you know, over the years, from Stoic philosophers, you know, to today's phenomenologists, but that it is vulnerability, which incorporates also, I think, that our vulnerability to death is something that remains very, very well-guarded secret when it comes to people, I think, who are young and healthy. And adjusting to illness, or adjusting, I think, possibly to some kinds of disability, is not just a matter of making, you know, practical arrangements and so on, but it's actually adjusting to this idea that you are vulnerable, that you are frail in some sense. So yeah, I really like this comment, because I think it's a universal truth that we invest a lot of effort in denying as a society, and live without an acknowledgement of that state, of that fundamental fact, for large portions of our lives, until things go wrong, I think.
Great, thank you. This is a question from Existential Audist. Thank you so much for your enlightening talk and deconstruction, Dr. Carel. My question is, in terms of a vision and practical steps to overcome and/or transcend vulnerability, what would you see as a key mode of activism and advocacy around shifting the paradigm of autism, for example, as a deficit into part of the human condition and empowered neurodivergence rather than lack?
Yes. So I think this, there's two things. Actually, sorry, can you read out again the second part about autism, please, Maeve?
Yeah, sure. So what would be a key mode of activism and advocacy around shifting the paradigm around autism, instead of seeing it as a deficit, seeing it as part of the human condition and a form of empowered neurodivergence rather than a lack?
Yes, thank you. Okay. So I really can't speak on behalf of people with autism or non-neuroprevalent individuals, and I don't want to, but I can say something about amelioration. So I think neurodiversity, the neurodiversity movement has some really interesting lessons and interesting processes in it, but I'm not sure that process would be possible for, say, so I have a lung condition. I can't see that an analogous process would be appropriate or possible for those kinds of disability. So I think it's very hard to talk about disability in general. But in terms of ameliorative strategies, Ian and I had some proposals in our paper. So I'll just briefly mention them. So the first is to tailor institutional norms and values in exactly the way I think neurodiversity proponents suggest. And I've written about what I call the relativizing norms. So if you take a child with additional needs or a learning disability, you can see a very, very surprising celebration when they manage to, say, spell their name. And you might say, well, all 6-year-old kids can spell their name. But that's precisely not being sensitive to the particular situation of this individual. So relativizing norms, and my appeal here is particularly to people who work in healthcare, social care, and education, can be really helpful. And what that can do is to, for example, tell us how to interpret norms in relation to the specific individual we're trying to talk about. So for somebody with cognitive deficits, transparency of information can require more of the institution rather than just saying, oh, if you need it in Braille or in large print, we'll give that to you. Transparency of information might mean, oh, somebody actually needs to check the uptake and understanding of that person. So relativizing the norms and not thinking, oh, we're just serving this homogeneous crowd of people, all of whom can read our forms and so on. So institutions have to acknowledge that sometimes an additional effort is required to understand what an individual's needs are. And also to make increased efforts to ensure that the freedom of vulnerable people is protected and valued rather than being overridden for the convenience of institutional processes. The second is cultivating institutional appreciation and human diversity. And I think this comes close to what you mentioned. So we want institutions to tailor and relativize their norms to individual people, but we also want them to resist this standardization. You know, so you say, okay, it's for good reasons of efficiency and fairness. Everybody needs to queue. Nobody's going to get prioritized here. But actually, some people can't queue, right? So what we need to do is to ensure that some of the ideas around access that institutions, I think, have largely adopted can be kept and broadened for these kinds of ameliorative processes that I was mentioning. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. I think, yeah, we have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid. Thank you so much, Havi, for that really excellent talk. And thank you for all the really great questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them. And yeah, thanks to Shelley and Joe for putting on this great conference. Thanks, everyone.